Right. Hi. My name is Sebastian Hetman. I'm a freelance editor and a published writer from Poland. I mainly write science fiction and essays these days. As I've been born in Eastern Europe and grew up there, my work has been influenced by science fiction from Russian and Eastern European writers from the late 80s and early 90s. And nowadays I live in Berlin, a city of people who speak a language I barely understand. I'm listening to Harry Potter in German to learn German, and that's how I know that German for troll bogey is troll pupil. Another fact I think will come in useful anytime soon in life. Anyhow, I want to begin with a statement that readers don't give a shit. And if that's not a strong opening, then I don't know what is. But I mean this in the most generous possible sense, because I want to start off this presentation where most of your readers start off. That is, for example, when they're browsing for books in a bookstore, or like you, imagine yourself looking for a movie to watch on Netflix. You scroll through dozens of productions. Every single one of them, every single box on your screen is a production into which millions have gone to. And you have a team of dozens of actors, then a crew of at least 200 people working on it. And you would have a budget of millions. And people have poured their hearts and souls into that production, into that movie or a TV show. And you spend probably about a second and a half saying, that's not for me. The same thing happens in a bookstore, because every single book, if you think about it, every single book is a work of art. Some author has worked, between half a year or a year, pouring every single thing they had in their heart and in their mind onto pages. They pulled a manuscript together. You know how hard that is, and they edited it to perfection, and then they sent it to editors like me who butchered the manuscript and tell them that it's not perfect. And after a long process, the manuscript becomes polished enough to send it to copy set to setters, and then it's wrapped in a beautiful cover, and it's shipped to a bookstore just for you. It's there for you to notice it, but you just walk past it. It didn't grab your attention, and that's more or less the place most of your readers will be in. And if you appreciate that, then you can learn how to open strong, because your readers will not be paying a lot of attention. Lots of things in their lives will be competing for their attention, and your book will be just one of the hundreds of elements each day that demand their attention. So the question naturally becomes, how do you make your readers care? First of all, you can't make everybody care. Think of all the great movies you haven't seen. I have a friend who hasn't seen The Gladiator yet. She hasn't seen The Gladiator or Indiana Jones or Avatar or any of the Alien movies. And she knows they are great movies. She wants to see them. She just has never got around to watching them. Caring about your book and your book being great or good are two completely different things. You shouldn't try to convince your readers that your book is great. What you should do instead is tell them what it is. You should tell them what the story is about, so the readers can decide for themselves. Because if you think about all the demands on our time and our life, when we pick a book to read, we really want the author to be successful. We want this to be the best book we've read all year. We want it to be the book we talk about with our friends. We want it to be the book that will go big in the next year, so we can say, "Hey, I've read it first. I found it first." So readers really, on one hand, they don't give a shit, but on the other, when they have your book in their hands, that they are really cheering for you, because they want this to be the book that they want to read. Now, what you need to tell them is, of course, what your story is about, and there's a couple of elements to that. I stole this from Lisa Cron's Wired for story, because I think it's very good. There are a couple of elements to every single story. There's the what happens, and that's the plot. It's the one thing that writers get very excited about. There's the someone who is the protagonist of the story, and this is where fantasy authors will sometimes not spend enough time talking about who that someone is or what drives them. Same for science fiction, because the world building is so exciting. Then there's the goal that is known as the story question or the major dramatic question. And then the last element, how he or she changes, is what the story is actually about. And this is, you can't fit all of that onto page one, but you should try. You should at least give a glimpse of that whole picture to your reader on page one, because then you can help them decide to pick your book as the one they want to read. So where do you begin? How do you begin to explain such a big picture to your reader? There are three concepts that I use when working with writers, and that's character, conflict, and premise. Those are the three most basic elements, very, you could even say primitive. There are the first three things that the reader is looking for on the page. It's the someone, it's the someplace, and it's the some trouble. So character, conflict, and premise, that's someone, someplace, and some trouble. And those are the things that you normally don't think about, not consciously when you read a book, but it's what you subconsciously are looking for to get your bearings on the story. That's those three elements help you hook the imagination of the reader. Now, I have a couple of examples with me. None of them will get the Pulitzer Prize this year, but I wanted to write a couple of simple examples, quick and dirty, to show you how the basic concepts work in practice. After the presentation is over, I would like to have one of you share their story, their character, conflict, and premise, so we can talk about it more live. But for now, let's stick with the examples. So example one, there's a guy in a bar, and he has a knife sticking out from his chest. The blade has missed his arteries by an inch, and a group of thugs closes in on him. Now, would you like to know what happens next? It may be that this isn't your kind of a story, but this kind of an opening tells you very clearly what kind of a story it is, so you can decide, maybe it's a noir detective story. I really want to read it. I want to see what happens next. I'm a sucker for those stories. Example two. Cold War era, the pilot of a spy aircraft is shot down over the Soviet Union. He tries to bite on the false tooth that's filled with cyanide, but the tooth, it falls out of his mouth and is now bouncing around the cockpit as the plane spins. He fumbles for it, but it's too late. The plane crashes and the pilot survives. Again, would you like to know what happens next? I would. Presumably, he's captured. He tried to kill himself, but didn't manage to. Now he's captured by the Soviets, and if we look for the elements, the character, conflict, premise. The premise obviously is the Cold War, a spy plane flying over the Soviet Union. The conflict is the fact that he wanted to die and instead he was captured and the plane crashed in the Soviet Union. But this also tells you what kind of a person the protagonist is. The pilot is the kind of a man that would rather kill himself than be captured by the enemy. Next, example three. An alien colony ship arrives in the solar system in 2021. It's unarmed and we are unarmed. Unfortunately, we're both a threat to each other's existence. The aliens lay claim to Mars and tensions escalate fast. An expert on linguistics assembles a team that must establish communication before war breaks out. This is a pretty neat setup for a science fiction story. And I wrote a couple of different examples to show you storytelling from different levels of detail. This obviously is more high level. Usually as science fiction stories begin with the world building at the front. The character here is the expert on linguistics. Then the whole setup is the colony ship arriving, and the conflict is really how both civilizations interact. Because with our current state of technology, we are not prepared for interplanetary warfare. And I thought it would be very interesting if we had a colony ship from some alien species that is not prepared for war either. So the first thing that we would resort to would be throwing stones, which, if you do from the orbit, is a very dangerous thing to do. Now, example four. In a world where sorcery is abundant, one day all magic runs out. Cities fall from the sky, mage towers collapse, magical creatures die in anguish. It's horrible. A once great empire lies in ruin. The emperor calls his most trusted inquisitor. I heard rumors, he says, of a child that was born at the precise moment that magic has gone out of the world. Find the child and kill it. Again, character concept premise. Character conflict premise. The character in the here, it could be either the emperor, which would, I imagine, as an old frail man, honestly, like a Roman emperor. So maybe that wouldn't be a good protagonist, but the Inquisitor, she could be a really good protagonist. The conflict is obviously finding the child, because it's presumed that the child is the source of this calamity, but it's not confirmed. So there's a mystery to be solved, and the premise is really an empire that has fallen into ruin just yesterday, basically. So again, character concept premise, and the question, as with all beginnings, is would you keep on reading? I know I would. The last example is is a bit of a joke, but Donald Trump declares war on China, and this is only to show you that this doesn't have to be a lot of words. It's character, conflict, and premise. Donald Trump declaring war in China. It's a simpler version of that I heard in an anecdote some time ago was Hitler invades Poland. That's a free word opening that has both character, conflict, and premise. Those three elements are very, very basic. They are the things that our imagination needs to get its bearing on the story, to put us into the story so we can experience it ourselves. But as you get those three elements down, then the question becomes, how do you develop them? And you need to answer three questions, really. Question one is, whose story is it? And if we use the Inquisitor example, we could say, I'll scroll up. We could say that the most trusted Inquisitor, she's a woman around 30. Let's call her Rosalia, and Rosalia has just lost her husband, and that's not really enough to start imagining the story. So we may start wondering what else about Rosalia would be interesting. What kind of an interesting answer could we give to who Rosalia is? And as I was digging through this idea before the workshop began, I realized it would be really interesting if Rosalia, for example, was pregnant. Imagine an inquisitor who's pregnant, who has lost her husband and is now sent to find and kill some innocent child, because the emperor has gone mad, and the emperor imagined that the child has basically destroyed his empire. And that brings a lot of inner conflict, because then you would have the conflict of the basic humanity of a mother who has lost her husband with loyalty. And as story development goes, then I have to ask the question, so what makes her so loyal to the emperor that she would even consider such a quest? And a neat element that popped into my mind was, maybe she was an orphan and the emperor has adopted her sometime early in her life. And from being completely abandoned by her mother, her parents, she has grown to be one of the most influential people in the empire. The empire lays in ruins, but the emperor is still alive, and she's still very loyal to him. Anyhow, you can see by how by asking interesting why questions or digging deeper into each element, we can see the story developing. Now, the second question is, what's happening here? And what's happening in this case is pretty obvious, that the empire has crumbled. People who have been running the empire, so the mages, or whoever have you, they have basically become like everyone else. So they're no longer significant. There's a power vacuum that will need to be filled in. And through that power vacuum, through a world where such a powerful power vacuum exists, the protagonist, Rosalina, she will have to travel and find that child that supposedly cursed the whole world. And what's at stake? One thing, presumably that child has caused the calamity, but we don't know that. Rosalina doesn't know that, and the emperor doesn't know that. It's just a presumption. In a way, it feels heavy, the burden of finding that child. At the same time, she's pregnant, so she has to protect herself, and she has to fend for herself in this new strange and hostile world. And as the story progresses, you can kind of imagine one domino tipping over another domino, and all of them following a trajectory where she will be forced to face the question, all right, is who am I going to choose, the emperor or the life that's growing inside me? And that's a difficult choice. That will be we have to make it, as writers, we have to make it a difficult choice. And I know this panel was called How to Open Strong, and right now I'm talking about things that happen later in the story. But for us, for an opening to be a really good opening, it has to be a promise that's for the whole book. It can't just be for the opening itself. So anyway, if your opening offers an interesting answer to all those three questions, the reader will want to know what happens next. And that's because in literature, the opening usually promises how the whole thing will look like. If the opening is big and epic, then obviously we're in for a big epic ride. If the opening is small and intimate and character focused, like the one we described with Rosalina, someone who's torn between her loyalty to an emperor of a bygone empire and a life growing inside her, that we expect the whole story will follow a similar trajectory and will have a similar theme that's not big and epic, just very small and intimate. Anyhow, if you open well, the rest of the story usually falls into place. But from my experience in editing, it definitely takes a lot of back and forth of what you imagine for the whole story to be, then versus what you have written in the opening, versus how the character developed later on, versus what you probably should rewrite, but then you start realizing it will be a lot of work and a lot of rewriting. So we need to find a good balance between all those elements when you design your opening. And I like to start with openings when I work with clients, because it's where you plant the story seed, really. And if you plant that story seed well, then the whole story will work. And if you fail at the beginning, then maybe halfway through you'll realize that your story isn't going anywhere, and you'll need to rewrite from step one. Anyhow, so that's for the presentation I had for today. I will take questions from the chat, and I also need one brave volunteer who would like to discuss their story with me on live chat.
Do we have any willing volunteers and or any questions?
All right, log.data says I could. First come, first served. Before we do a live presentation, are there any?
I don't have any questions for you right now. Somebody is typing, hold on. Okay, we do have a question. Do you have any thoughts on the actual opening lines in terms of grabbing attention?
So, yes, and probably not what you're expecting, but the opening line doesn't have to be beautifully written. There's this myth that the hook has to be the most brilliant piece of writing in your book, but it really doesn't. If you start, during a recent workshop I was doing, someone asked me for, but how do I open, and I said, well, you could say, that my book is about spaceships and dragons and battles. And that would be a very clear hook for people who like spaceships and dragons and battles. And they would be, they would say, oh, this is brilliant, I want to keep reading. So the opening line isn't that important as everyone thinks. There are a few quite memorable ones, but it's not as important. What is more important to me is letting your reader into the story.
Do you have a favorite opening?
I have I have two I can quote and one that I cannot. So I'm a very big fan of the prose in the book The Name of the Wind. I know that it said something about it being the silence in three parts, and then it went to beautifully and poetically describing a camp after an attack, if I'm not mistaken. But my favorite line of all time was from Neuromancer by William Gibson. It's one of the first cyberpunk books, and it says the sky was the color of a TV tuned into a dead channel, or something like that. I don't have it at hand, but I really like that, and I also liked it was the 6-word story of children's boots for sale, never used. It's a really strong, hits you in the face kind of an opening to a story. Honestly, the first line can be cool. It can be a place where you can show off, but it's not a prerequisite. There are plenty brilliant stories that I have no idea how they began.
How do you know you're starting your story in the right place?
I'll quote Lisa Cron again from Wired for Story. She says that the game has to be afoot. There needs to be a ball in play, not the prelude to a ball, not the description to a ball, the actual ball in play. It doesn't have to be the main ball, but there has to be a ball in play at the beginning of a book. And another good indication of where to begin is the old-fashioned in media res in the middle of things that I think comes from Hemingway. You don't want to begin too early when things are just warming up, because no one has time for things to warm up, and read 20 pages of prose doesn't do much anything. You want to open when the action is already happening. Something is amiss, something is about to happen. You get this sense of a great change coming over someone's life, of a great shift of power, or maybe something that will overturn the balance of things in someone's life.
How quickly and how much space do you have to establish those 3 points?
Oh, I have a cool anecdote for this. I was on I think it was on a Worldcon. I was speaking with an editor for one of the science fiction magazines, and she said that if the manuscript doesn't have character conflict and premise established within the first 150 words of a manuscript, or even shorter than that, then she just doesn't bother to read. And all the slush pile readers, they're also told not to read if the 3 elements are not established at the beginning. And this is why I said, Hitler invades Poland, because it's, a 3-word opening to a story, character, conflict, premise in 3 words. I'm pretty sure that in the near future, someone will come up with just 2-word opening. But you can do it in 3 words. You can definitely do it within a single paragraph. 2 or 3 paragraphs are okay too, because and there's some criticism about this rule for 150 words, because this is only because people stopped paying attention and everyone's distracted by their phones nowadays. But it's not. I mean, that depends how you choose to see it. If you respect and value your reader's time, you will offer those things up front and then just start developing and building on top of them. So it's good practice to have them within the first 150 words of your manuscript.
Next question. Are there any craft books you recommend to work on openings specifically?
So Wired for Story is a good one, but it's a good book if you have around 5 years of experience writing, because some of the concepts may be quite alien. For example, one of the basic concepts of storytelling is that we read stories because we need to survive. We have been taught to look for information that we may find helpful in the future. That's why we imagine interviews with imaginary people, or when we make a decision, we we think what others will think, and stories help. Stories put us in situations that would never happen in our life, or that we don't want to happen in our life, but that may happen. If there's a war, or if we start making colonies on the moon or the Mars. So stories put us into the shoes of different people, and they put those people into trouble. So we don't have to get into trouble, and we can experience loss, we can experience love, and all those things in between, from the safety and comfort of our reading chair. So anyhow, back to Wired for Story. It's a really good book on writing. It has a very strong chapter on openings, but it talks mostly about the psychology of reading, what makes readers tick, about all the subconscious assumptions that go into reading.
Another question. So how do I make sure my start reads as the same quality as the middle? Some books have a clear line where the chapters haven't really been worked on as much, and how do I prevent that from happening?
Well, you can hire an editor, and if they're pesky, they will tell you, you need to fix this, and they will go and butcher your darlings, and at the end of the process, you will have a book that's practically even. But if you're self-editing, then you have to ask yourself, I'm assuming that if you're asking this question in the chat, you have an impression that maybe some of your chapters are out of whack with the rest of the book, or at least you have seen examples of books that haven't been properly edited. And that's what editing is for. If you read your manuscript, you have to leave comments to yourself saying, this needs brushing up, this needs editing, this needs fixing up, and oh, this is a really bad chapter, rewrite it. And that's how you make a book even, or at least read evenly.
Last question, at least for the moment. How do you make sure your promise fits the book if you have multiple points of view?
That's a good question. How you open the book itself, the first pages, it's not the first pages of each POV. It's the opening of the book. It's what you do physically when you go to a bookstore and you pick a new book that you want to check if it's worth reading or not. I won't tell you the name of the book, but I recently was vying for some new science fiction story to read, and I found this book that had a pretty cool promise about alien linguistics and establishing communications between us and some other species that was some in the other on the other corner of the galaxy, and I thought, wow, this is a pretty cool concept. And I just skimmed the next couple of chapters, and they were all taking place in Colorado or somewhere on a farm. Yeah, not the kind of story I want to read. But it also showed, and I'm sure you had books like that too, where you opened the book, it said, oh, this is cool. And then as you started to read, it wasn't really that. It was a promise that the author has broken in a way. So when you write the opening, make sure it's the opening is a story itself. It's the kind of a story you want the whole story to be. Think of, in Aladdin. I'm not a big fan of the movie itself, but the opening, the opening song called Arabian Nights, I think it's one of my favorite musical songs recently. And if you listen into that song, it promises you what the story is going to be, and in that spirit, you need to write the opening for your whole book, so the book can deal with many different themes and characters and all that. But the opening credits and the opening song that goes with the story, that needs to be the promise for the whole thing.
Awesome, and thank you. That's been all of the questions that are in the chat. Do you want to move on to the volunteer to talk about their story? Yes. Or okay,
lock that data. If you don't mind unmuting, I would love to hear what your story is about. And let's start with character conflict and premise. And what I want to do is a presentation on how to develop those elements. So, you start with putting them on the page, but you need to start growing them soon. So we'll do a little bit back and forth.
So basically, I should just start characters, and then we'll go on to the other elements.
Yeah, the first character.
Yep. So like I mentioned in my question, I have two main characters. One is his job is basically a glorified delivery boy, but he's been working his way up the ranks to make sure he can find a knife that his parents lost, in the hopes that when he brings it back to them, they'll accept him again.
Okay, a knife, is that did I hear that
Yes,
right?
a knife. It's like an old archaeological artifact.
Knife. Okay.
And the other character is an up and coming politician who is trying to work her way up an aristocratic system, in the belief that if she works hard enough, it'll work in her favor and she'll be able to change the world for the better, that no one will have to grow up as poor as she did.
Okay, and for the opening scene, if we go with the glorified delivery boy, what's the premise? So where does the scene take place?
In the opening scene, he is. It starts with him remarking that it's been 6 years since his parents, or basically it's been 6 years in the city looking for this knife, and he still hasn't found it.
What kind of a city is it?
It's an underground city.
Underground city.
With lots of twists and turns and kind of steampunk feel.
Cool. And the conflict?
The conflict is that his boss is late and he has a meeting to find out more about the knife pretty soon. And if his boss is too late, then he might miss that important meeting with his informant.
Okay. Now, I'm going to get really pesky now. Hope you don't mind.
Perfect. I have my notebook right here.
First of all, so why is he a delivery boy?
Because his boss basically for almost a whole year, when he went to this city because his parents were in a different city, or his family was in a different city, he realized basically the only profession in this city that really has an overview over all the happenings and all the kind of small changes and where everything goes are these delivery boys. But specifically, like there's different ranks of them. The highest ones are the ones that also do official business.
That's okay.
Right?
Now, why is his family, or what his family thinks of him, why is that so important to him?
Because, I mean, so basically for the first 15, 16 years of his life, he was always trying to do the best. They were the only people he had, basically, obviously. And then he had one rebellious moment because they're quite a political family, and he refused their arranged marriage. And they instantly kicked him out.
Okay, and why are they important to him still after that?
Because he basically has fooled himself into thinking that their love is the only love that matters.
Okay, and what kind of a person, or we're getting into the Jung psychology, but what kind of a person is so attached to their parents? Because it almost sounds like he has Stockholm syndrome.
I mean, almost, but he's a very anxious personality, and that's also something that is shown in the book as well.
Good.
But he's basically being at every turn he's basically trained himself to find some connection. It's almost paranoia in a way as well.
Okay, and I hear that he is looking for acceptance.
Yes.
And usually that means, when someone's so obsessed about acceptance, it means they had very little of it in life. Let me fish for another question. So why is their acceptance and approval so important? Why? What does he hope to gain? But really, not just being accepted back into family, but emotionally, what is he hoping to gain when he finds that knife? What does he imagine will happen? That they'll welcome him back with open arms?
No, but he expects to be able to make sure they don't treat his sister the same way
I'm not sure I follow.
He basically thinks that if he can come back and if he can get back into the family and his family at least accepts him or tolerates him in a way, he can
Mm-hmm.
basically make sure his sister knows, make basically be there as a shield for his sister.
Okay, and why does he want to be a shield to his sister?
Because she was the only one, like you said, his parents gave him very little acceptance, and she was the one who was actually there for him when he.
Okay, that's good. By the way, that's worth weaving into the opening
Yep.
because it promises the theme that's going to return in the book. Um, Now, how could we make the conflict a bit more related with his need for acceptance? Because he doesn't really care about the knife itself, he cares about being accepted. There's a part about his sister, there's a part about the knife. Uh, are both parents still alive, or they're
Yes,
those distant political figures I imagine in tuxedos and the father
basically,
in a
yeah.
top hat, mother in a big dress?
Yeah, they're both still alive. There is another element because there is also a love interest that shows up. And that love interest is also introduced in the first scene, though it doesn't happen yet in the opening scene. Maybe it should. Um, Protagonist convinces himself that this person showing genuine interest in him because he has to train him to be one of the new delivery boys
Mhm.
is somehow a spy or something connected to his parents because clearly something's going wrong here. This is not how it works, etc., etc.
Okay. My mind is drawn to the theme of the sister,
Mm,
and when you develop a story, the protagonist usually lives within the shadow of some lie, and in this
yep,
case, it's the lie that finding the knife will make everything okay,
yep,
because
exactly.
it won't. His parents will still be distant.
Yep.
So that's probably a theme you want to play on in the opening, a chat with the sister, saying that he doesn't need to do it because she'll always love him or always be there for him, would be a good setup to let the reader know what his inner problem is.
The problem with that is, however, that the sister is basically they're in different cities. His parents are and his sister are in the original city, and he hasn't seen his family at all the past 6 years. Because they're such a highly political family, it's just tough to get close to them, and he's
Then
been in this different city.
let the conversation take place over a letter. That wouldn't be too difficult. Anyhow, so moving on, you say because the element that doesn't quite fit here is that you say his boss is late
Yep.
and he's waiting on clues. Uh, that's not tied into this character arc. It's not tied into his problems. It's not tied into his why.
The reason I have the part of being late is to kind of show that, at least for the beginning of the novel, he is somewhat of an unreliable narrator. His boss is late, and he immediately starts thinking of theories and all sorts of possibilities why his boss could be late. Maybe his boss isn't showing up at all. And then his boss shows up, and it's like, oh no, okay, I was wrong. Whoops. But he doesn't.
What
It's not showing his theories. He's thinking, oh, this has probably happened. Wait, no. What if this has happened? Oh, maybe this has happened.
is this a first person story or a third person story?
Third person.
Third person. Do you need an unreliable narrator? Or do you just need to let the reader know that the character is anxious?
A bit of both. He is unreliable in the way that, for example, for example, the love interest we only see through his eyes, obviously.
Hmm.
But first, this character is developed also as, um, or look, the reader is shown to think, or is told to think that this new character showing up is clearly some shady person, but basically by setting up the opening that he's a very hyperbolic and
Hmm.
unreliable thinker, the reader can know, oh, okay, maybe this person is not as terrible as they seem.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's a lot harder to get back from kind of the peaks if the reader thinks that everything that the main character.
But you could still
assumes.
achieve that effect with the third person limited POV. But because unreliable narrators, to me, they mean that the reader cannot trust what they're being said. And if you use the third person limited, then you can let the reader know that what the character is experiencing is not the objective truth, but at the same time, the narrator himself, the person who's doing the narration, they can be trusted at least. Because I'm trying to warn you against, I guess, using an unreliable narrator, because that complicates storytelling in the long run, unless it serves a very strong purpose in the story itself.
Basically, the reason I use it, basically, protagonist becomes less of an unreliable narrator as the story goes on, and he realizes that he thinks this way, and basically becomes more reliable by also specifically thinking and talking about these thoughts and these things.
Now, can you tell me how the opening scene relates to the whole story? Because you say that he's waiting for his boss. And sorry for being pesky, but
No
is the story about waiting for bosses?
No, but the story is about. It's very much about community and about structures
Good.
clashing.
Good. Then you need to open with a structure and with society structure clashing. Do you have an idea how to weave that into? Because what I'm basically offering is an idea for a different opening.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'd have to rethink the timeline a bit, but that is a good. Because I'm realizing now, for both point of views, the opening is not. There's a bit of a promise, but the tone in these scenes does not yet fit, especially second half, at all yet. So.
If you think about what I said from what your story is about, so what happens is the plot, it's the events of the story, but they happen to your character. The way I explained it to one of my writing friends here in Berlin is. If you have a character who's a very shy guy, he would sit in the park, very quiet, hunched, reading a book, then the plot is basically a mugger who approaches the guy and says, give me your money. And the guy is awkward and shies away, and the mugger, approaches him more face to face and says, give me your money. And you can feel the tension rising. And at some point, the mugger may pull out a gun, put it to his head and start pushing him down. That's how plot needs to feel to the reader. You have a person, a real person, like your delivery boy, who has an inner issue. In the example I used, it's just general shyness and being unconfrontational. But in your case, it would be anxiety. So you need a whole series of events that will challenge your protagonist's anxiety. The mugger that approaches closer and closer and puts a gun to his head and pushes him down and down, until the protagonist say, I can't do this anymore. Screw anxiety. I want to be my own man, and breaks off with anxiety. That's how it has to feel for the whole story. Every single event that takes place from the first scene to the last scene needs to be something that challenges your protagonist's problem.
Yep.
And on that happy note, I think we can move on to maybe another question, or if there are no more questions, then wrapping up this this workshop. Thanks for volunteering. What's your name, by the way? Sorry, I didn't ask that. Log that data.
My name is Leon.
Leon, nice to meet you, Leon.
Nice to meet
Thank you for volunteering. That was very helpful.
No worries.
Awesome. And thank you, Leon, for volunteering. And thank you, Sebastian, for coming out and hanging out with us and giving us the wonderful presentation and answering all of our questions.
Thank you very much. It has been my pleasure. I'll drop my website and everything into the How to Open Strong chat. Anyhow, if you need to talk over your story structure, openings or whatever, you'll know where to find me.